Story number 1. The final detention. Every student at Riverview High knew the golden rule: never get detention on a Friday. Most thought it was just a scare tactic. Teachers said the school closed early on Fridays for maintenance, but the rumors said otherwise. The stories varied. Some claimed a janitor had gone mad and still wandered the halls. Others whispered about a student who disappeared decades ago, her ghost prowling the building after hours. No one took it seriously, except for the unlucky few who found themselves trapped in detention after the final bell. Mia had never been in trouble before. She wasn't the type, but a misunderstanding with her English teacher had landed her a Friday detention. "I'm sorry, Ms. Harris," Mia had pleaded. "It wasn't my phone, I swear." But Ms. Harris had been unrelenting. By 3:30, Mia sat alone in room 112, the clock ticking loudly in the silent classroom. Ms. Harris had left her there, promising to return in an hour. The first 20 minutes passed uneventfully. Mia doodled in her notebook, trying to ignore the creeping shadows as the sun dipped lower. Then came the noise, a faint scraping sound, like nails dragging across the floor. Mia froze, her pencil hovering above the paper. The sound came again, louder this time. "Ms. Harris," she called, her voice trembling. No response. Mia stood, her chair scraping against the floor, and peeked out into the hallway. It was empty, the fluorescent lights flickering faintly. "Hello?" she called again. Silence. But as she turned back to her desk, she saw something that made her stomach drop. Her notebook, the one she'd been doodling in, was now closed, and scrawled across the cover, in jagged handwriting, was a single word: run. Mia's breath quickened. She grabbed her bag and bolted for the door, her sneakers squeaking against the linoleum. The hallway stretched endlessly before her, dim and unfamiliar. She knew the layout of the school, but something was wrong. Doors that should have led to classrooms were gone, replaced by blank, featureless walls. The air grew colder, and that sound, the scraping, followed her. Closer now. Faster. Mia dared to glance over her shoulder. A figure was emerging from the shadows. It was hunched and humanoid, but wrong in every way. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted unnaturally to the side, and its skin glistened like it was wet. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, fixed on her. Mia screamed and ran, her feet pounding against the floor. She turned corner after corner, her panic rising as the hallways refused to lead anywhere familiar. Finally, she spotted a door ahead, slightly ajar. A faint glow spilled from the crack, and she sprinted toward it, throwing herself inside. The room was empty save for a single desk and chair in the center. On the desk was an old, dusty notebook. Its cover bore her name. Her hands shook as she opened it. The pages were filled with writing, not hers, but unmistakably about her. It detailed everything she had done that day, right down to the moment she'd entered the room. The final entry read, Mia sat down and waited. It didn't take long for it to find her. The door slammed shut. The scraping sound was right behind her now. She turned, tears streaming down her face, as the thing stepped into the room, its mouth stretched into an impossibly wide grin. The lights flickered once, and then went out. On Monday morning, Ms. Harris returned to room 112 to find Mia's backpack sitting on her desk. But Mia was nowhere to be found. A faint message was scratched into the desk's surface. Not her first. Won't be her last. The janitor sealed off the room that afternoon, but some students claimed they could still hear Mia's screams echoing through the halls on Friday nights. Story number 2. The Chalkboard Curse. The old chalkboard in room 13 of Glenwood High had been there since the school opened over 80 years ago. While most classrooms had upgraded to whiteboards and smartboards, room 13's chalkboard remained, a massive, dark slate with ornate carvings along its wooden frame. Students whispered that it was cursed. They said that if you stayed behind after class and wrote your name on the board 3 times, something terrible would happen. No one could agree on what exactly. Some claimed you'd see a shadowy figure appear. Others said your name would vanish entirely, as if you'd never existed. Nobody dared to test it. Until Jake. Jake was a skeptic and a joker, always looking for ways to prove the school's ghost stories were nonsense. When his friends dared him to write his name on the board after school, he laughed it off. "Easy," he said. "This'll be the lamest thing ever." The room was empty when Jake entered after the final bell, the soft hum of distant chatter fading as the halls emptied. The chalkboard loomed at the front, its surface dull and scratched with faint marks from years of use. Jake grabbed a piece of chalk, its brittle texture scraping against his fingers, and approached the board. With a flourish, he wrote, "Jake Miller." Nothing happened. "See," he said to his friends, who lingered at the doorway, watching nervously. He wrote it again, "Jake Miller." Still nothing, but as he lifted the chalk for the third time, the room grew noticeably colder. His friends shuffled uneasily at the door. "Hurry up, Jake. This isn't funny anymore," one of them said. Jake smirked and wrote it one final time, "Jake Miller." The chalk snapped in half as the last letter was completed. For a moment, everything was still. Then the chalkboard groaned, the sound low and deep, like a distant rumble of thunder. Jake stepped back, his bravado faltering. The letters of his name began to shift, the chalk dust writhing as though alive. The letters twisted and stretched, forming a new word, "Stay." "What the hell?" Jake whispered, his heart pounding. The board's surface rippled, and a hand, a pale, bony hand, emerged from the slate, its fingers impossibly long and tipped with jagged nails. The hand clawed at the air, grasping for Jake. "Run!" one of his friends screamed, bolting down the hallway. Jake stumbled back, but the hand shot out farther, grabbing his wrist with an icy grip. "Help!" Jake yelled, struggling as the board seemed to pull him closer. His remaining friends froze in terror, watching as the black surface of the board stretched like liquid, beginning to swallow him. Jake's screams echoed through the empty halls as he was dragged into the chalkboard, and then silence. The next morning, room 13 was locked. When the principal was asked about Jake, he shook his head in confusion. "Who?" he asked. "We don't have a Jake Miller on the roster." Jake's friends insisted he existed, but no one else seemed to remember him. The only trace of him was on the chalkboard. If you looked closely, you could see faint, dusty letters spelling his name, Jake Miller, etched permanently into the slate. But students claimed if you stared too long, you'd see something else. A shadowy figure behind the letters, watching, waiting. Story number 3, Locker 103. Locker 103 had been locked for years. Unlike the others, its door was scratched and dented, the paint chipped around the edges. No one ever saw it being opened, and no one was assigned to it. Rumor had it that something terrible happened there long ago, but the details had faded into whispers and half-forgotten stories. Still, students avoided it, except for Ben. Ben was new to Hollow Creek High and didn't believe in the superstitions that kept the other kids wary. When he saw Locker 103 standing unused, he decided to claim it for himself. It started with the lock. When Ben tried to open the locker, it didn't budge. The lock was rusted and worn, the numbers on the dial barely visible. "Why don't you leave it alone?" a girl nearby asked. Her name was Emma, and she'd been at the school long enough to know better. "Why?" Ben smirked. "Is it haunted or something?" Emma didn't laugh. "Just don't mess with it, okay?" she said, glancing at the locker as though it might respond. But Ben wasn't one to back down from a challenge. That afternoon, armed with a screwdriver he borrowed from shop class, Ben returned to Locker 103. The hallways were quiet, most students having left for the day. The screwdriver scraped against the metal, the sound echoing unnervingly through the empty corridor. After several minutes of prying, the lock snapped open. "Easy," Ben muttered, tossing the broken lock aside. He gripped the handle and yanked the door open. The locker was empty. At least, it seemed that way. As Ben looked closer, he noticed something carved into the back wall of the locker. "Help me!" The letters were deep and jagged, as if someone had scratched them into the metal with desperate force. Ben frowned, reaching out to touch the marks. The moment his fingers brushed the surface, the temperature plummeted. A rush of freezing air blasted from the locker, sending his papers scattering down the hall, and then, faintly, he heard it. A voice, whispering. Ben stumbled back, his heart pounding. The whispers grew louder, though he couldn't make out the words. Suddenly, the locker slammed shut with a deafening clang, the force rattling the nearby doors. Ben stared, too terrified to move. Then, slowly, the lock on the ground began to move. It slid across the floor as if pulled by invisible hands, snapping back into place with an eerie finality. The locker was locked again, but now, something was different. Ben's name was scratched into the metal of the door. The next day, Ben tried to tell Emma what had happened, but she wouldn't listen. "I warned you," she said, her voice trembling. "Whatever you let out, it's your problem now." By lunchtime, rumors were already spreading. Students claimed to hear strange noises near locker 103, whispers, faint knocking, and even quiet sobbing. Ben avoided the locker, but it didn't seem to matter. That night, as he lay in bed, he heard it again, the whispers. Soft at first, then louder. When he opened his eyes, the shadow of a figure stood at the foot of his bed. Its face was pale, its eyes empty hollows, and it was holding the broken lock. The next morning, Ben didn't show up to school. When the janitor went to check locker 103, he found it locked tight, but now 2 names were scratched into the metal: Ben Parker and Help Me. Nobody tried to open it again.